So the topic this week is renewed in witnessing. A witness is just somebody who testifies, so what they've seen and heard. And it seems to me, biblically, there are two strands, if you like, of evangelism or witnessing. There's the evangelist, there's the one who's gifted in evangelism, in the proclamation of the gospel. Not only does that, or those individuals have a gift, but they're also seen as a gift to the church. There's a whole list in Ephesians 4 about how God gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors and teachers to build up the church. There's always a gift to the church, which the church needs to be built up. But then there's also the evangelism of what you might call everyday life. Sometimes that's been called gossiping the gospel, which I think is a great phrase. And that's brought about by living out lives that shine, lives that stand out, such that people ask questions. So, for instance, this is what Paul, I think, had distinguished. If you look in Colossians chapter 4, which comes after Colossians 3, and Colossians 3 is just all about how to live the Christian life, the kind of qualities of a disciple. And it summarises then in chapter 4, and where he says this: continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I'm in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And it seems Paul's making a distinction between his ministry, where he needs a door for the word so he can declare the mystery of Christ, proclaim the gospel there, and clarity of speech, and the ministry of the Colossian church, the people in the church, there to pray, to continue in prayer, to pray for Paul, to walk in wisdom towards outsiders, having gracious speech seasoned with salt, and to know how to answer. Peter says something similar in his first letter, chapter 3, verse 15. He says, in your hearts, honour Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defence to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. It's as though the evangelists proclaim and the believers are to give answers. Now at the moment, in our current environment, engaging with anyone is quite difficult. But then we are also in an environment where people are asking about what's going on, and there's a certain hopelessness around, which I think is a God-given opportunity for us to show off our hope. I think it has something to do with making most of the time. But it's also how all this stuff ties together. We have to be filled with the Spirit to empower us, not only to speak but to live the kind of life that is growing in Christ-likeness. And we have to have the Word of Christ dwelling in us richly, so that we know what it is we believe and why we believe it. I think at the moment the one-to-one conversations that we have, which are slightly easier than anything else, just because of the restrictions we're under, those conversations I think can go deeper, because people seem to just want to talk a bit more, but it seems to be that much easier at the moment just to engage slightly deeper with people. And I think at the moment those one-to-one conversations are probably the most significant at this current time. That's something I learned many years ago. I had just started work in what was quite a small computer department at Bostik in Leicester. And I was talking with my boss, who was called Bill, in his office, and he'd been asking, I think, what I'd been doing the weekend, that sort of thing, and I felt very brave and said I'd been to a Christian meeting, And so he asked me about it. He said, well, what is that? What's it about? What is it that you believe in? And he's quite intent on this. So I shared the bridge illustration. So just as a slight diversion, if you know what that is, that's great. If you don't, I haven't got time to do it in this video. So as a shameless plug, I've got a little blog site going, which is, there's a link to it in the Thursday update, and I'm putting some of these talks in there, and I'll put the bridge illustration in that if you've not seen it before. So Bill listened quite carefully, quite intently to this, and he watched as I drew it all out. And then when I got to the end, he said, well, that's all very well, but first of all you have to believe in that. And he pointed at the word God, which was in the illustration. And it kind of drew the thing to a close, and we never really talked at that level much after that. Obviously we talked, but not about Christian things. And I felt that was a failure. I'd done that wrong. I should have tried to listen to where Bill was at first and try and address that rather than launch out. So later, as time went by, we moved to Macclesfield and kind of lost contact with Bill. And as I was involved with young people's groups and the like, we would talk about the bridge illustration, and I'd often use that experience as this is how not to do it, and because I just thought at the time that had been a failure. But some years later, we had a phone call from the Down Syndrome Association. They'd had a call from someone called Bill who said he knew me. Could I call him back? So I called him, and he said, oh, he'd remembered that one of the last things before we kind of all moved and lost contact was that we were in the process of adopting a child with Down syndrome. So he called the association kind of on the off chance that they might know us. But his big message was, Mike, I've become a Christian. That was, wow, really? How did that happen? Well, I knew it, but wow. And it had happened some while before that phone call, but they'd had a session at his church where they were just thinking about the influences that led up to the people in the group there had to become Christians. And he said his story had started with that conversation we'd had in his office where I'd shared the bridge. And he said, what I didn't know was that a lot of things had been going on in his life, and I'd unwittingly, unknowingly stirred them all up, which he couldn't talk about, but I'd put them into a context. There was the gospel, and it kind of fell into place for him, but he wasn't ready, so he had to push back to give himself time. But it was like a seed that had been planted, and now he's involved in a Christian support ministry down in Leicester, helping out people who have mental health problems. So very often we don't know the results of our conversations. The process of a person becoming a Christian is like a chain, and we are just links in that chain. But I felt just God was very gracious here and just gave me the privilege to know that the conversation I'd had years ago actually bore fruit. And that's not to say the others don't, it's just that we don't always know. So I just want to close with a couple of verses. One is two verses from Isaiah 55, verses 10 and 11, where God says this, for as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. And a great verse from the New Testament, Paul ends 1 Corinthians 15 with this verse, therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing in the Lord your labour is not in vain.